When she entered my life, my loneliness slowly faded away, and on that very same day, without realizing it, I began losing pieces of myself. It took me nearly 3 years to understand which loss mattered more. I'm 82 years old now, and there's something I wish I had admitted much sooner. When I was 68, I met someone. Everyone around me celebrated it. My daughter smiled and told me I deserved happiness. My neighbors said it was good to see me moving on. Old friends shook my hand as if I had won some great prize, and for a while I believed them. I convinced myself that I had finally filled the empty space inside me. But nobody noticed what was really happening. Nobody asked. For almost 3 years, I woke up every morning at 5:15. I've always been an early riser, and before I even opened my eyes, there was this strange feeling sitting in my chest. It wasn't pain. It wasn't exactly sadness either. It was quieter than that. Something heavy, something that made it harder to start the day. I couldn't explain it back then, but I remember this clearly. The morning she packed her things and left, I walked into my kitchen, brewed my coffee, sat down in my favorite chair by the window, and for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. At the time, I didn't understand why. I'm not telling you this because I'm bitter. I'm not angry. And I'm certainly not saying relationships are wrong. I'm simply an old man who still feels younger than his years, and who learned something far too late. And I'd rather tell you now than have you spend years discovering it the way I did. But before I tell you what I lost, and believe me, I did lose something, you need to understand who I was before she walked into my life. Because the man I was at 67, he's the man I've spent the last decade trying to find again. My name is Richard Bennett. My wife Susan passed away in 2008, a sudden infection. From the day we received the diagnosis until the day I held her hand for the last time, only 7 weeks had passed. People called it merciful. I never understood that word. For almost 2 years afterward, I drifted through life like a shadow. I'd walk into rooms and forget why I was there. I'd stand in the grocery store staring at shelves, unable to remember what I had come for. There were days I barely spoke, but little by little, something changed. You see, I spent 40 years working as a carpenter, building things, repairing things, making sure they lasted. And when something breaks, a man like me doesn't sit around waiting. He gets to work. So I tried to rebuild myself. Behind my house, I converted an old storage shed into a workshop. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy workbench, shelves lined with tools, and enough space to lose myself in honest work. I started small, a picture frame for my granddaughter, a rocking chair for my daughter, then larger projects, coffee tables, cabinets, bookshelves. By the time I turned 66, my days had settled into a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I woke up at 5:15, made my coffee, sat on the porch for 20 quiet minutes, whether it was raining or freezing. By 7 o'clock, I was in the workshop. I'd work until lunchtime, take a short break, then return until evening. Simple, peaceful. And if I'm being truthful, I was content. Then my daughter Emily began to worry. It happened during Christmas dinner in 2013. She looked across the table and grew quiet. "Dad," she finally said, "don't you ever get lonely?" I smiled and told her I was fine. I told her I enjoyed my own company, but she wasn't convinced. "You spend so much time by yourself," she said. "That can't be healthy." A month later, she called me. There was someone she wanted me to meet. Her name was Linda Parker. She was 65, a retired school teacher, widowed for nearly 5 years. "Just lunch, Dad," Emily said. "Nothing serious, just lunch." I told her I'd think about it. The truth was, I wasn't unhappy, but there was a quiet loneliness inside me, a loneliness I never talked about. And maybe a part of me wanted someone to notice it. Looking back now, I can admit something I didn't understand at the time. I had no idea what trying to solve that loneliness would eventually cost me. Then my friend George got involved. One morning, while we were collecting our newspapers, he stopped me and said, "Richard, life isn't meant to be spent alone. Give this woman a chance." People spoke to me as though I was broken, as if the quiet mornings I treasured were somehow signs that I needed rescuing. Pay attention to this part, because this is where I went wrong. I started listening. And when everyone around you seems certain about something, you begin to wonder if maybe you're the one who doesn't understand. You begin to doubt your own happiness. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, slowly. By the spring of 2014, I finally agreed to have lunch with Linda. She was thoughtful, easy to be around. She asked about my woodworking projects. She laughed at stories that weren't particularly funny. She spoke lovingly about her grandchildren and somehow made every story interesting. Driving home that afternoon, I felt lighter. Maybe Emily was right, I thought. Maybe this could be good. One lunch became dinner. Dinner turned into regular visits. By the end of summer, everyone around me seemed relieved. Emily called more often. My friends smiled when they asked about Linda. And I won't lie to you, those first months were pleasant. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not passion, not even love, something simpler. I felt noticed. But there was something I didn't understand. Linda wasn't really getting to know the man I had become. She was getting to know the version of me I was presenting, the version who always dressed neatly, the version who made reservations and remembered birthdays, the version who enjoyed long conversations. Meanwhile, the real Richard was still the man who found peace alone in his workshop before sunrise. And sooner or later, those two men were bound to meet. And when they did, we discovered they wanted very different things. The changes happened so gradually that I barely noticed them. Linda loved mornings. She liked to talk while coffee was brewing. She would tell me stories she had heard on television, speak about family matters, or simply share whatever was on her mind. And I listened, because she deserved to be heard. But the truth is, I have never been much of a talker before breakfast. I like silence, always have. Susan understood that long ago. Linda never really understood it. For her, silence felt uncomfortable. To her, quiet meant something was wrong. She never criticized my workshop, not once. She was too gentle for that. Instead, she'd stop by around mid-morning. "Just wanted to see what you're working on," she'd say. Then she'd stay. She asked questions, good questions, kind questions. But every answer took me away from what I was doing. Every interruption pulled me out of the rhythm I had spent years building. So I started going into the workshop earlier, and before long she started waking up earlier too. There is something I have rarely admitted. I wasn't angry. That was what made everything so painful. Linda wasn't selfish. She wasn't controlling. She wasn't trying to change me. She simply wanted to share life together, and there is nothing wrong with that. The problem was that I had spent years building a life that depended on solitude, the way some people depend on sunlight. Without it, something inside me slowly faded. Then one chilly morning, nearly 3 years after we met, I stood by the kitchen window with my coffee in my hand. The workshop stood only a few steps away, but I realized something that frightened me. I didn't want to go inside. Not because I had lost interest, not because I was tired, but because I knew that within an hour the quiet would end. Whatever I began would eventually be interrupted. And I found myself asking a question that stopped me cold. When did I stop looking forward to the place I loved most? I searched my memory, and I realized it had been a very long time. I had stopped taking on large projects, stopped losing track of time while building, stopped waking up with that peaceful excitement I once felt every morning, and I hadn't even noticed it happening. Little by little, I had made my world smaller, not because anyone forced me to, but because I had convinced myself that my own way of living wasn't enough. And that realization hurt more than I can describe. Because for years, people had kindly suggested that I needed someone, that being content alone wasn't truly happiness, that solitude was simply loneliness wearing a different face. And eventually, I started believing them. A few weeks later, I ended things with Linda. It was one of the hardest conversations of my life. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked quietly, "What did I do wrong?" And I answered honestly, "Nothing. You did absolutely nothing wrong. The mistake was mine. Emily didn't understand. George thought I was making a terrible choice." But the first morning after Linda moved out, I woke up at 5:15. The house was quiet. There was nowhere I needed to be, no expectations waiting down the hallway. I walked into my workshop, placed both hands on my old workbench, and just stood there for hours. Not because I had something to build, but because I needed to know that I still could. So let me tell you something. No matter how old you are, if people tell you that you must have someone to be complete, if they insist that being alone means something is wrong with you, question that belief. Not because love is bad, and not because companionship is a mistake, but because choosing company simply out of fear can cost you more than loneliness ever will. I know the fear of dying alone. I've felt it. But at 82 years old, I know something I didn't understand when I was younger. Dying alone is not the greatest tragedy. Living the final chapter of your life as someone you no longer recognize, that is far worse. Because when you are truly yourself, your mornings belong to you. Your silence belongs to you. Your memories belong to you. Your garden, your favorite chair, even the cup of coffee that grows cold while you're lost in thought. Sometimes that is enough. And if it is enough for you, don't let anyone convince you otherwise. As for me, after all these years, I've finally stopped searching for something to complete me, because I discovered that peace was never missing. It was waiting patiently for me to come back home. And these days, when the sun rises and the world is still quiet, I sit on my porch with my coffee and I smile, because after everything, I know exactly who I am. And for this old man, that is more than enough.